Good evening, listeners. It's me, your host, Ramblingramm. I'm here with some more stories to scare, shock, and horrify you. Or possibly, just possibly, let you know what's really out there in the dark. Enjoy, listeners. Canadian Paranormal Encounters. Panic at Manic 5 by Manon Lysette. We all know everything on No Sleep is true, but sometimes it's hard to believe someone when they're a 15-year-old girl one week and suddenly a 45-year-old father of 3 the next. That's why I wanted to do something different. Over the past couple of months, I've been putting out feelers to friends, family, colleagues, and even strangers to collect and share real paranormal encounters they've experienced here in Canada. It's been a little tough going because I tend to be pretty shy out there in the real world, and it can be awkward to ask strangers if they've ever seen a ghost. But I was really surprised by the positive reception and people's openness to discuss the topic. Turns out, if you ask around, almost everyone has had some sort of paranormal encounter or another that they're willing to share. They're not all super interesting though. With their blessing, I'll be relaying their stories to you in this series entitled Canadian Paranormal Encounters. Quick note, I typed up these accounts in the third person because it felt weird to write in the first person, given they happen to other people. I know it's not the norm on No Sleep, but it makes more sense to me. This first story comes from my mother's cousin, Jean-Francois, who worked at one of Quebec's largest hydroelectric dams back in the early 1970s. He was hired by Hydro-Quebec as an engineer, and his job mainly involved patrolling the Manic 5 powerhouse, checking the valves, maintaining the turbines, making necessary repairs, that kind of stuff. He was never alone at the facility, but the workforce was fairly small, so he'd often go hours without seeing anyone else. Before I begin his story, I just want to put things into context. If you already know how hydroelectric dams work, feel free to skip this explanation. If you don't, here's the too long didn't read version. 1. Build a big wall on a river, in this case the Manicouagan River, to create an artificial lake. 2. Build a powerhouse with turbines nearby downstream. 3. Funnel water towards the top of the powerhouse and use the awesome power of gravity and water pressure to spin the turbines, which generates electricity. 4. Harness the almighty power of electricity. 5. Dump the water back into the river at the bottom of the powerhouse. The cool thing is, if the river has a good enough flow and is long enough, you can build multiple hydroelectric dams on it and keep juicing that same water for all it's worth. Hence the name of the powerhouse Jean-Francois worked at. Manic 5. Manic for the river, Manicouagan, and 5 for the dam number. Technically, due to circumstances I'm not going to get into here, Manic 4 was never built, so Manic 5 is actually the 4th dam on the river. But that's not really important here. Explanation over. On to the story. Manic 5 had only been running for a few months when Jean-Francois was hired, and Hydro-Quebec was having trouble staffing the powerhouse. He figured it was due to the dam's remoteness. It was about 3 to 4 hours away from civilization, with only one lonely road to and from. The distance made it impractical to commute, so the staff would spend the entire week at the facility and swap out with a second crew every other week. On the phone, Jean-Francois recounted the first time he drove up to the dam. He described it as a massive concrete behemoth peeking out from above an ocean of trees, like the outer wall of a castle that didn't exist. It had a weight to it that went beyond that of its building blocks, and the water it held back. He felt like it was watching him. The wall was the only thing between him and a flood of water that would wash him away forever. A guardian. A tombstone. The powerhouse was so close, if anything were to bring down the dam wall, he'd have just enough time to know death was coming, but not enough to run. I guess you could liken it to living under a volcano. He was paranoid the dam wouldn't hold. He inspected it every chance he got, searching for fissures and leaks, but never finding any. Intellectually, he knew it was built tough and wouldn't break, but he couldn't shake the nerves. It was like looking out over a ravine and knowing there's only a guardrail between you and certain death. How strong is that guardrail? Do you take it at face value that it'll hold? He barely slept his first week there, keeping his ears open for any sign of impending doom. But at first all he heard was the ceaseless drum of water rushing through the turbines. Then, one night, as he was staring at the cold concrete ceiling in the makeshift dormitory, he heard a dripping noise. Any deviation from the norm naturally struck a chord of terror within him. It was kind of like bracing to feel the iceberg hit, and then hearing a light scraping along the hull. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Already drenched in sweat, Jean-Francois got up to investigate. The powerhouse was full of criss-crossing concrete corridors, making the source of the sound difficult to pinpoint. With nothing but a flashlight in his shaky hands, he walked up and down, straining his ears to differentiate between echo and source. It was only once he had reached the lowest floor that the sound became loud enough for him to confirm he was headed in the right direction. He swept his flashlight left to right, until he caught something shimmering on the floor. As he approached, he realized it was a puddle coming from under a door where they'd been planning on installing a security office. Now, if it's not obvious enough, water inside a hydro dam full of electrical equipment. Yeah, it's not a good thing. He scurried to the nearest supply cabinet and slipped into these really thick rubber boots for insulation. He returned to the door and found the puddle had grown. Not a good sign. Unsure what he'd find inside, he cautiously opened the door, imagining a wave of water waiting to sweep him away. He found the room empty, but for a large puddle of water in the middle of the room, slowly spreading towards the corridor. This was a relief, because it meant it was likely just a leaky pipe, and not, a tidal wave of doom. So there he was, in the room, searching for the source. He checked the walls. Nothing. He checked the ceiling. Smooth as silk. He crouched down and inspected the floor to see if it was bubbling up through a crack. Nothing. He felt a droplet hit the top of his head. Okay, he figured. It probably ruled out the ceiling too fast. He backed away and aimed the flashlight up, squinting to find the source. He heard a few drips, but couldn't see movement or water clinging to the surface. He looked back down to the puddle, and saw a droplet splashing into it. This is the part of the story where Jean-Francois's voice began to falter. I could tell, even so many years later, it still freaked him out. There was this distinct uncertainty in his voice, as though he was both afraid to say what happened out of honest fear, and out of fear of ridicule. Silence hung on the phone for a few moments, and then he continued. He told me he panned the flashlight back up very slowly, and that's when he saw it. There was a droplet hanging in the middle of the air. It slowly curved inward in a J-like shape, pooled, and then fell into the puddle. Jean-Francois swears it was as though it was following the curve of someone's cheek, all the way down to their chin. He stood in stunned silence as another droplet emerged out of thin air, somewhere between 5 and 6 feet in the air. Drip, drip. He ran out of there so fast he almost lost one of his boots. He ran back to the dormitory and shook one of his colleagues awake. Exhausted, confused, and more than a little grumpy, he reluctantly followed him back down, not even 10 minutes later. The puddle was gone, but in its place were wet, bare footprints walking all around the room, up the walls, on the ceiling, and finally leaving out the door and disappearing halfway down the hall. Jean-Francois said he refused to go back to that section of the powerhouse after that night, but he heard others also found puddles leaking out from under that door. They ultimately built the security office in another location and converted the space into a storage room. But even that wasn't enough. The room was later sealed off with concrete, under the guise there was some sort of flaw in the foundation. But they say, even today, they sometimes find puddles under the name-sealed wall. Canadian Paranormal Encounters. Vision in the Rare Book Collection. By Manon Lysette. I heard this story from a librarian after a tour of the rare book collection at the Library of Parliament. This was actually what spawned the idea of writing about real Canadian paranormal encounters. But since it was kind of spur of the moment, I didn't have anything prepared and didn't take notes. What I'm trying to say is, please forgive me if I can't remember little inconsequential details, like the exact floor number. I didn't take down the librarian's name either, so I can't follow up with her to verify those details. But they don't affect the story, so I hope that's okay. What happened was the tour group and I were in one of the library sub-basements, maybe 2 or 3 floors down, where they keep the rare books. We were there maybe 30 minutes in all, and every 10 minutes or so the lights would turn off, leaving only 2 emergency fluorescents open on either end of this really long room. The librarian said it was nothing to worry about. We just had to move a bit to trigger the motion sensor, so the lights would turn back on. It was some sort of combination energy-saving measure, as well as to help protect photosensitive material. No real biggie. As I stood there in the dark, I remember thinking how eerie the room looked, with row upon row of old books, boxes, and displays hidden under blackout drapes. You know that thrill you get when you sit around a campfire telling scary stories? That feeling was creeping up on me, That's why I lagged behind once the tour group moved on, and helped the librarian pull the blanket back over a display she'd unveiled for us. And then I blurted out the question that started this all. Got any ghost stories? I was expecting a laugh or a dismissive wave of the hand. I was not expecting the apprehension on her face, or the way it looked like she was trying to swallow cement, as she gauged whether or not I was serious. I almost chickened out and rejoined my group, because of the whole social awkwardness thing. But I've been trying to come out of my shell, so I forced myself to mumble a half-baked explanation about being into horror, and how old buildings usually have stories to tell, or something like that. I forget my exact words, but whatever I said, it swayed her, and got her to share something she'd experienced a few years prior. It was after hours, and she was alone in the rare book collection, working late to bank vacation time. The library had been doing a bit of reorganizing, and she was hard at work sorting a box of books that had just been transferred in from storage. The rare books aren't actually organized in the same way a normal library would organize them. No Dewey Decimal System or anything like that, and most hadn't even been registered in their electronic system yet. Yes, I can feel you librarians reading this cringe. So it was a really slow-going process. During the tour she'd mentioned it's not uncommon for them to find books they thought lost or destroyed, and come across books that they didn't even know they owned. The room is organised like so. A long central aisle sectioned by support beams, and a large wooden glass displays for the most impressive rare books. Doors on the far ends of the room, motion sensors for the lights next to each door, and rows of compact bookshelves on either side of the central aisles. If you've never heard of compact shelving units, they're basically these big metal bookshelves on tracks. Instead of the typical shelf gap, and so on and so forth, these bad boys are all squeezed together with only enough room for one gap at a time. It almost doubles storage capacity. But the downside is, if you need to consult a book in a row without a gap, you have to move all the bookshelves between it and the current gap by manually turning these three-pronged hand cranks on the side of each bookshelf, like you're opening a submarine hatch. The librarian had been working in a row on the left side of the room, when the lights automatically turned off. Since the motion sensors only pick up movement in the central aisle, she stretched her arm out and started waving blindly. When this didn't work, she stretched further, her torso now in the aisle, and that's when she caught movement from the corner of her eye. It was just for a passing second, but she saw someone in old-timey clothing on the right side of the aisle walk by before they disappeared behind one of the support beams. The lights flickered on. Now, normally someone in old-timey clothing would have been extremely odd and a sure sign it was time to get the hell out. But the Library of Parliament actually has a changing room one floor up from the rare books collection, full of costumes of old prime ministers, their wives and other historical figures, from a discontinued programme where they'd walk around Parliament acting out scenes for visitors. She figured a colleague was playing a prank on her. So she dashed around the support beam to try and scare them first. The aisle was empty. She walked up the aisle and peered towards the bookshelves. But like I said earlier, they're all squeezed together, and the gap on the set of bookshelves on the right side of the room was on the very end, so there was nowhere for someone to hide. Convinced she had imagined the person, She went back to work. After all, she figured, if someone had truly been walking down the aisle, the light would have turned back on immediately after turning off. She had barely placed another book when she heard the grinding shriek of old metal coming from the right side of the room. The distinctive sound of a hand crank being turned. It was accompanied by the slow, scraping sound of a heavy bookshelf moving along its track. She slowly and nervously peered out, expecting to see her colleague turning the crank, but instead found the aisle empty again, and the noise silenced. Now she was thoroughly freaked out. She retreated back into her row of books and anxiously tried to get back to work. No sooner was she out of sight, however, did the noise pick back up again. This time she inched her way very slowly out of the row and peeked out from behind the bookshelf. The hand crank was moving. It was moving slowly, but it was moving. She couldn't understand what she was seeing. Those hand cranks can't move on their own. It takes a bit of elbow grease to get them spinning. It's not something that, say, the wind can do. She stood there in shock for a moment, and then summoned the courage to take a closer look. With great trepidation, she crossed the aisle and walked to the shelving unit just as it clicked against the other, forming a new gap. She heard a thunk and peered into the row, only to find a book on the floor leaning against the wall. She described her mental state as being in kind of a haze at that point, like she couldn't wrap her head around what was happening. So she just did what seemed logical at the time. In hindsight, it wasn't the best idea. But she walked into the row and picked up the book with the intention of putting it back in its place. Before she could, however, she saw someone standing at the foot of the gap, blocking her exit. He was wearing old clothes, just like she had seen before, but she couldn't recognize his face. There was something about him that filled her with dread, and she only realized much later it was the fact that she couldn't see his lower body. He stepped aside and disappeared from sight, and suddenly she heard the squeal of the hand crank, and it was moving fast. The bookshelf began sliding towards her rapidly. She screamed, dropped the book and ran out just as the shelves were starting to squeeze against her. The aisle was empty. No sign of the crank-turning phantom. Suddenly a hand crank on the left side of the room started spinning wildly, closing the gap on the row she'd been working in earlier, and crushing the box of books she'd left inside. She booked it out of there like a bat out of hell, out the nearest exit, up the first of 3 flights of stairs. She heard footsteps behind her, but she didn't look back. Up, 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 and finally she was on the main floor, where the night janitor was mopping. She tried to explain why she looked so scared, but he checked downstairs and said there was nothing amiss. She says she's never seen anything since then, and never goes down there after hours. But sometimes, when she's at the door to the rare book collection, she'll hear the sound of the hand crank turning, even though the room is empty. Well, listeners, I sincerely hope you enjoyed the tales that I brought you this evening. It would be a great pleasure to me if you would like, comment, and subscribe, if you're not already a subscriber. And please wait for me to bring you more tales to alter your perception of how the world may really be. This is Ramblingramm, signing off. Good night, listeners, and sweet dreams.